Okay? Ah, good. Well, welcome. I'm Robert Hutchings. I'm a professor here at the LBJ School at the University of Texas. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel, and I will introduce the panelists briefly because you have their bios. I won't go through their whole bios in my introduction. I'll just say it's a really interesting time to be talking about Europe. After a period in which the attention of the world sort of shifted away from Europe, we tended to take for granted the achievement of a more united Europe. Now that assumption is being called into question, and the achievement of a more united Europe, including Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe, is one of the most monumental achievements of my lifetime. And I wouldn't say it's under threat, but it's facing numerous challenges from Russia, from the Greek debt crisis, from immigration, from Brexit, and I would say from the President-elect of the United States. So all these things are conspired to make Europe more interesting, let's put it this way. The period this panel will be looking at, that of the Reagan administration, was particularly pivotal in the evolution of Europe. Even those areas where nothing much seemed to happen, such as Eastern Europe, after the crushing of solidarity and up till 1989, there was a lot going on beneath the surface. So Eastern Europe was becoming pre-revolutionary, and it took a spark to ignite this revolutionary tinder. Western Europe was more obvious. It was a period in which decisions were made about the creation of a common Europe, a single European currency, single European market, and ultimately toward political union that were historic. It was a period of some divergence between Europe and the superpowers because US-Soviet détente went into a free fall in the early part of the decade, the 80s, but European détente, if anything, picked up speed. Just on a personal note, I was living in Germany in the first 5 years of the 1980s during the Euro missiles debate, the Baader-Meinhof gang, Red Army faction, Red Brigades in Italy. So it was a time of ferment there. In the last half of the 80s, I was in the Reagan administration, and then at the very end, I moved to the Bush administration at the NSC. So this period is really fascinating to me. And we have four excellent, five panelists, 4 papers, 4 excellent papers. I've read them all recently, and I really look forward to this discussion. I will try to moderate the time. I've asked the speakers to present for 15 minutes only, and then we'll save questions for the very end. I want to save a good chunk of time at the end for your questions, comments, and reflections. So let me introduce all the speakers briefly so that I don't have to interrupt them between presentations. Tomasz Blusiewicz is at Harvard. His topic is Reagan and Poland's Solidarity Movement. Elizabeth Charles and James Graham Wilson are both at the Office of the Historian at the U.S. Department of State. James is a product of the UVA PhD program, as was I, so I know he's going to give an excellent presentation. Susan Colburn from University of Toronto, speaking on Friendly Uncle, Nuclear Cowboy, Ronald Reagan, Transatlantic Relations, and the Fight over Détente. And Matthias Häusler from Cambridge will speak on a Reagan Revolution, Ronald Reagan, and the transformation of the transatlantic relationship in the early 1980s. We're going to go a little bit out of order because Susan and Matthias asked to flip. So we'll have Tomasz, Elizabeth, and James, then Matthias, and Susan will clean up. So, Tomasz.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor Hutchings, for your kind introduction. Because we have so much ground to cover today, I will skip the procedural thanks to organizers and so on, because we have like 15 speakers today, so we really need to stick to the 15 minutes. So I'll proceed directly to my paper. In February 1992, Carl Bernstein, in a then pioneering cover story for the Time magazine, wrote, and I quote, "The Polish trade union solidarity flourished underground, supplied, nurtured, and advised largely by the network established under the auspices of Reagan and John Paul II. Tons of equipment, fax machines, printing presses, telephones, shortwave radios, video cameras, computer, word processors, were all smuggled into Poland through channels established by priests and American agents and representatives of the Afl-Cio and European labor movements. Money for the banned union came from CIA funds, the National Endowment for Democracy, secret accounts in the Vatican, and Western trade unions. Much of the equipment destined for Solidarity arrived to Poland by ship, often packed in mismarked containers sent from Denmark and Sweden, then unloaded at Gdańsk and other ports by dockers secretly working with Solidarity. From the Polish docks, equipment moved to its destination in trucks and private cars driven by Solidarity sympathizers, who often used churches and priests as their point of contact for deliveries and pickups. Now, Bernstein's account merits attention for two reasons, I think. First, the exact mechanics of that covert maritime support for Solidarity still remain underexplored. What needs more research are precisely the maritime channels of traffic, from commercial shipping through cruise lines, fishing, even naval war games, and the ways in which these channels were utilized by the West to exert all kinds of influence, more or less camouflaged upon the Soviet bloc. My own dissertation is entitled "Return of the Hanseatic League: How the Baltic Sea Trade Washed Away the Iron Curtain." And in my project, I rely on the recently declassified Stasi, KGB, and Polish Służba Bezpieczeństwa files, as well as some CIA and Bundesnachrichtendienst materials, to precisely uncover the role played by Cold War Baltic cities, from Hamburg in the west to Leningrad in the east. And I think that the connection between the fact that Solidarność was first created in a port city, Gdańsk, which was its cradle and headquarters, and the fact that maritime channels were one of the main avenues of supporting the underground opposition in Eastern Europe are far from accidental. Secondly, Bernstein's account is slightly inaccurate. Those underground, or sometimes even underwater, to be precise, networks, as I demonstrated in my paper and in my dissertation, were in fact pioneered across the Baltic largely by Sweden in the 1970s. That is, they were not established by Reagan or the Pope, but rather the two leaders inherited and developed them. So we need to get this story straight in order to understand how Reagan's widely known and advertised intention to support the Polish Solidarność could materialize so rapidly and effectively, as well as in order to truly appreciate the tremendous role that those maritime channels and networks played in dismantling the Soviet bloc. So when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the Polish Solidarność had been an officially recognized trade union for over a year. Where his second term was over, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe were shaking, but no one predicted that they would all be gone by the end of '89. In a strictly chronological sense, then Reagan's presidency saw a period of continuity and then gradual transformation. So while transformation is certainly the right word, revolution perhaps would be an exaggeration, give or take how sharp a break we want to insert between the Reagan and Bush administrations. Nonetheless, certainly in Polish popular memory, for sure, it is Ronald Reagan who incomparably more than any other foreign leader is associated with ending the Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe, as is demonstrated by ample street names and monuments. And you can see one of them in the city of Gdańsk, unveiled just a few years ago, I think. And it's Reagan's profile here is in a striking contrast to his less appreciated successor, George Herbert Walker Bush. So Reagan owes this reputation perhaps more to his mastery of the symbolic and the theatrical rather than to any single foreign policy measure. To be sure, his administration's resolute adherence to the sanctions introduced in '81 and other hard means of power politics played no smaller role and have been appreciated by historians. In popular memory, however, he's chiefly remembered for his rousing speeches and potent one-liners. Reagan was a master of imposing his own narrative, even when his actual knowledge of foreign realities was not necessarily extensive. His unambiguous words of condemnation against the Soviet-backed imposition of the martial law in Poland signaled a sharp departure from Carter's softer language and posture. In this sense, Reagan both carried a big stick and spoke softly only when he considered appropriate, of course, that is very rarely, and usually from a position of power. So his holy alliance with the Vatican is widely appreciated, of course, and the authenticity of this elective affinity, I think, rarely questioned. What is lesser known, however, are those elements of Reagan's foreign policy that were quietly carried over from the détente years. Consequently, what I would like to stress here is not so much the new opening of 81, but rather the inner administrational continuities that in fact continued to transform the global landscape. They are worth emphasizing both because they are less prominent than Reagan's new departure, and also because some credit needs to be given for resisting that temptation, especially given the initial strength of Reagan's electoral ticket for a wholesale demolition, including a demolition of some aspects that had actually worked pretty well thus far, but perhaps were deemed by the electoral base at home as weak on communism. This continuity aspect goes against, I think, Reagan's stereotypical image as this hard-edged ideological crusader. Behind this facade, largely construed for domestic electoral consumption, there was a much more pragmatic and flexible foreign policy strategy. So the immense role of the Catholic Church in bringing down the communist regime in Poland is beyond any question, so is the significance of John Paul II. Reagan's main contribution here was to forge a deep personal relationship with Karol Wojtyła, which soon led to their unanimous voice on many issues. The Pope was a pioneer and the guiding force behind this partnership, while Reagan was, I guess, wise enough to follow the advice of his more experienced partner in Eastern European affairs. After the imposition of the martial law in Poland in December 81, the rhetoric in Washington and Vatican converged virtually completely. However, Karol Wojtyła was not only a devout Catholic, but also the head of an organization that, in Latin America at least, often came into conflict with the American agenda. The smooth transcendence over these potentially destructive tensions demonstrates that the Reagan administration was serious about a certain order of priorities, that is, subordinating everything to the one overarching goal of weakening Soviet influence around the globe, but especially in Eastern Europe, after the chance to do so has appeared on the horizon. Yet there was one other paradox to be confronted. Solidarność was both formally and practically a trade union. As the Polish historian Andrzej Friszke put it recently, Solidarity was certainly not a movement in favor of capitalism. Still, it is both Thatcher and Reagan today who are remembered as the two foreign leaders who did the heavy lifting that brought Solidarity to power in '89. So the acuteness of this paradox could be seen in broad daylight already in the first year of Reagan's presidency. He was supporting Solidarność while crushing the air traffic controllers' strike at the same time, and this gaping inconsistency was quickly exploited by Moscow's mouthpieces around the globe. So this Patko versus Solidarity acrobatics led to a somewhat unusual occurrence. The Wall Street Journal released an article supporting the Afl-Cio and its engagement abroad. This article was just one prominent example of how difficult it was for the new administration to strike a balance between overcoming the economic malaise at home and supporting various labor organizations abroad. What Reagan did initially was he simply allowed the spontaneous kind of grassroots support for Solidarity to be collected at home. He also let it depart for Poland undisturbed. Later, he became personally engaged in supporting the Union, particularly right after the introduction of the martial law. At the same time, he had to be careful, of course, not to cross the invisible red line provoking a Soviet intervention. While his staunch anti-communist stance never faltered, he remained open to the possibility of internal changes in the Soviet Union, which of course began to bear fruit after Gorbachev came to power. The Wall Street Journal article foreshadowed some of the rough horns of that fundamental trade-off between domestic and foreign policy that persisted until the very end of Reagan's presidency. The way that paradox was handled contains the key to understanding how the administration transformed world politics while setting the U.S. economy back on a path of sustainable growth. The kind of illusory, I think, advantage of hindsight. The fact that it was the Anglo-Saxon variety of capitalism rather than the Scandinavian social democracy that ensued after '89 in Eastern Europe needs to be fully discarded when studying the 1980s. In a general sense, Reagan's lesser-known contribution, I would say, consisted of a cultivation of the processes that had been set in motion by the Helsinki Accords and the human rights agenda, at least in some regions of the world. John Paul II was already at the helm of the Holy See for over 2 years at the moment of his inauguration. The Soviets had been around in Afghanistan for quite some time, and so was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, of course. The dissident Polish Committee for the Workers' Defense, as well as the process of supporting the grassroots opposition across the Iron Curtain, was already underway for several years at least. One of the last formal acts of the Carter administration on December 1980 was to inform the Soviets what a potential cost of an intervention in Poland would be. In this sense, the main contours of the international playing field had already been set for Reagan in '81. That's why I think it's important to highlight the administration's continued reliance on this Scandinavian, Swedish largely connection, and the fact of the matter is that that connection was largely initiated by the Social Democrats, Polish Jewish emigres, likes of Olof Palme, and other forces usually associated with the left. So why do I consider this fact significant? First of all, I think this continuation is either missed or misrepresented by historians. But more importantly, I think it demonstrates the wide extent of Reagan's bipartisan kind of pragmatism, especially when confronted with a deficit of more ideologically aligned options. In other words, Reagan chose not to rely on the channels of influence forced by people who, in other contexts, were certainly outspoken critics of his course, as demonstrated by the widespread opposition to deployment of cruise missiles and so on and so forth. So the ability to eventually transcend those deep-seated divisions in the Western camp without compromising America's leading role was the underlying foundation of the successful aspects of Reagan's foreign policy. So in my paper and in my dissertation, I talk about some of the details about how those maritime channels were used by the CIA and various other services. So because we are I'm running out of time, I will not delve into details here, but if you're interested, now you know where to look for them. So concluding, I believe that the genius of Reagan's strategy was rooted in its all-inclusive and flexible nature, contrary to its outwardly uncompromising trappings. The president was both quite relying on the macro-scale societal processes evolving in the post-Helsinki environment, and then reverting back to the hard military options as demonstrated by the SDI, Able Archer, and so on. So he was thus able to bring together in this quasi-dialectical, even Hegelian fashion, all conceivable levers of influence and deploy them simultaneously while keeping Washington's official tone always free of ambiguity. So I would say that this combination of continuation and new opening is also evidenced by his reliance on old and tried advisors such as Zbigniew Brzezinski and adding some new blood such as Richard Pipes. In this sense, one can speak of a gradual accretion of expertise and a better coordination of efforts rather than a revolutionary start. And one last final thought. I think what was new at the moment of Reagan's inauguration was the lack of a direct Soviet military intervention in Poland. And this was a partial and forced, but still a break with the Brezhnev doctrine, and provided a short window of opportunity that was seized by the US, despite the country's preoccupation with the transition period between administrations. So in this narrow sense, Reagan's early moves in foreign policy were certainly, almost by definition, a reaction to Soviet adventures. But they were skillful enough to clear the ground for the strategic offensive of the second term. The first term, in President's own words, was more of a return to the good old and pretty straightforward Eisenhower, rather than a transformation. But as Gorbachev would say, life keeps on teaching us new lessons. Before making the great leap, one has to return to their roots yet again. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tomasz, and you were on 15 minutes exactly. It's amazing, precedent that you set. So let us now turn to Elizabeth and James.
I'm obliged to begin with a statement here that the views expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of State or the U.S. government. I have to say this every time. I really mean it this time. And the paper is based on declassified and publicly available sources. So Elizabeth and I have been working for the last 5 years on, we're just about done with 4 really big U.S.-Soviet volumes covering the Reagan administration for the foreign relations of the U.S. series. The first 2 we have now online at history.state.gov. All in all, we have about 50 Reagan-era volumes in production, and they will be rolling out every few months as we go forward in time. I'd like to start with a quote from January 20th, 1989, from a very widely read newspaper at the time, and Henry tells me it was very widely read in academic circles as well. The quote is, "It has to be admitted that we all not only underestimated Reagan fairly frequently, but we also greatly oversimplified him. His outward simplicity was taken for simple-mindedness, his rhetoric for substance, and his ostentatious toughness for an inability to be flexible. Who was he really? The Reagan of the years 1980 and 81 who promised to leave communism on the ash heap of history, or the Reagan of 1987-88 whose signature is on the Soviet-US Treaty on intermediate range and shorter range missiles, the first agreement in history on the physical elimination of 2 classes of nuclear weapons." The author of this profile deferred to a recent edition of Fortune magazine with a quote, "It is hard to evaluate Reagan's presidency because it abounds with paradoxes." Indeed, in this journalist's words, one of the main paradoxes is that the Reagan administration's achievements in the area where it had no plans and where no one expected anything of it, I mean the sphere of Soviet-US relations. How and why did this happen? The answer is simple. The world has changed. People's sentiments have changed in the United States, in Western Europe, and everywhere. Ronald Reagan must surely have appreciated this generally positive assessment of his presidency that appeared on the front page of Pravda in January 20th, 1989. He may also have smiled at the suggestion that he entered office with no plans and low expectations when it came to the Soviet Union. We know the quote we heard yesterday that Reagan had confided in his advisor, Richard Allen. What was his objective? Well, we win, they lose. He said to another advisor around the same time that his purpose was to end the Cold War. There has got to be a way. When he left office, Reagan regarded the Cold War, we would say, as neither won nor over. He said, "My view is that President Gorbachev is different from previous Soviet leaders," he said in his farewell Oval Office address. "I think he knows some of the things wrong with his society and is trying to fix them. We wish him well, and we'll continue to work to make sure that the Soviet Union that eventually emerges from this process is a less threatening one." The Russia that emerged from the ashes of Gorbachev's reforms in January '92 proved to be less threatening, at least for a while. The causal relationship between Reagan's Soviet policies and transformative change in the Soviet Union is a complicated question that has generated much debate and will do so in the future. And our focus in this paper is to try to flesh out 3 phases of Reagan's Soviet policies. 1, the perception and framing of the Soviet threat. 2, deliberation and decision. And 3, the execution of policies. Elizabeth and I find that Reagan's optimism was the common variable at each phase. Quote, "The country is in the grip of a national sickness," Mr. Vasiliev in Pravda wrote. Peanut farmer Jimmy Carter, as having said during the 1980 campaign. "No," Ronald Reagan responded, "America is walking tall once again and looking to the 80s with courage, confidence, and hope." And I think that that quote really encapsulates a lot about the differences. Now, let me talk for 30 seconds about the first part, which is the perception and framing of the Soviet threat. We know it's very clear in Reagan's diaries when he enters office what he thought was the problem. "High spot a National Security Council meeting," he wrote on February 11th, 81. "We have absolute proof of Soviet and Cuban activity in delivering arms to the rebels in El Salvador, also their worldwide propaganda campaign, which has succeeded in raising riots and demonstrations in Europe and the US." Now, Tomasz has laid out what I think was the biggest short-term possibility of catastrophe, which was the potential Soviet invasion of Poland. The chief long-term threat was the continuation of the negative trend in the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union that had really commenced in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll hear more tomorrow on the panel on nuclear weapons. I would just say quickly that the perception of Soviet strategic advantage did not abate over time, and particularly even in the second administration, in the end of this administration, where you had the coming online of the Soviet SS-24s and 25s. In a national intelligence estimate in December 1st concluded that Reagan said that the large sunk costs in production for new strategic weapons and the fact that such production facilities cannot readily be converted to civilian uses mean that Gorbachev's industrial modernization goals almost certainly will not have major effects on strategic weapons deployments through the mid-1990s. Let me close by saying that although the Reagan administration certainly went to great lengths to play up the ferocity of Soviet forces in the 80s in publications like the Soviet Military Power, which had an overlay of a Soviet tank factory on the National Mall, it did not fundamentally misrepresent Soviet strategic capabilities. And I based that assessment on, first and foremost, the treaties that we ultimately got on INF and START. And if you kind of look back and triangulate the figures and the numbers, and then look back what the administration was saying about Soviet capabilities, I don't think that there's a real gulf there. And I'm also basing this on the really terrific set of oral histories that the Office of Net Assessment did with Soviet generals that's available on the National Security Archive website. The murkier question was the extent to which those capabilities shaped Soviet intentions. Following his interactions with Gorbachev, the president was confident that he could share SDI, and SDI, again, was the answer, the way of getting around dealing with this intractable problem of Soviet strategic advantage, and the president was confident that he could share it with Moscow in the hope of someday eliminating these weapons.
And I'm going to take us back to 1983. So my section of this paper deals with deliberation and decision-making. And I chose to kind of write about this one period in time from early 1983 until the summer of 1983, when George Schultz really seems to take hold of what Reagan is trying to do in relation to the Soviet Union and push back against the NSC and kind of move forward with Soviet policies. So I want to start with a quote from Reagan's diary on April 6, 1983. "Learned in the office, George S. is upset. Thinks NSC is undercutting him on plans he and I discussed for, quote unquote, quiet diplomacy approach to the Soviets." He then talks briefly about the Pentecostalists. And then he goes on, "We had a meeting later in the day and George and I cleared things up, I think. Some of the NSC staff are too hard line and don't think any approach should be made to the Soviets. I think I'm hardline and will never appease, but I do want to try and let them see there's a better world if they will show by deed they want to get along with the free world. So I think this April diary entry really encapsulates the issues that were going on in the spring and summer of 1983. Clearly, Reagan has given George Schultz a mandate to talk with Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, to try to push the four-part agenda that they laid out in NSDD 75, which is a really big document in January 83. The four-part agenda dealt with human rights, bilateral relations, arms control, and one other thing. I'm having a Rick Perry moment. I'm sorry. Anyway. Regional issues. Thank you. Sorry. Did not have enough coffee. Right. So Schultz and Reagan seem to be on the same page. Reagan and Schultz had a lot of private meetings. One very famous meeting Schultz describes in his memoir very fulsomely is when he goes to dinner with Reagan in February during this blizzard, and he had just come back from China, and he and Reagan have this really deep conversation about communism and communist states, and Reagan seems, to have a very different attitude than his public rhetoric and persona, which was very tough and hard line. This very anti-communist public stance was very different from the Reagan Schultz talked to behind closed doors. So this is the big paradox of Reagan during this period. Publicly, he is very anti-Soviet, anti-communist. They lie, cheat, steal, all of these things. But behind closed doors, he is writing letters to the Soviet leaders. He is corresponding. He's trying to open up some kind of dialogue because of his optimistic attitude, which is kind of the current that runs through our paper. So Reagan's optimism was he believed in his personal ability to negotiate with the Soviet leaders if he could get, in a room with them. He believed that, the United States had gotten stronger. By 1983, the buildup, was working, the economy was slowly starting to turn around, but Reagan was in a position where he thought the Soviet-U.S. relationship could start to change. So he tells Schultz, let's start this quiet diplomacy. He didn't want it to be on the front page of the Post and the New York Times. You're unsure if it's going to work. What are the Soviets thinking about Reagan? Because he does have all of this very harsh public rhetoric. So Schultz starts meeting with Dobrynin fairly frequently. And I should say that all of this will eventually come out in my Frus volumes, which are stuck. James's volumes have come out. Mine will appear eventually, so I'm sorry that they're not out yet. It's not my fault. So they have all these meetings, Schultz and Dobrynin Schultz sticks to the four-part agenda. The one thing that Reagan really wanted Schultz to push on was the Pentecostals, which Sarah definitely talked about a lot yesterday, so I won't delve into it, but I do go into it in the paper a good bit. It's important because it is not done really publicly. And Schultz makes the point that with Dobrynin that, Reagan wants this to happen. And Reagan decision-making had a lot to do with, as many of the speakers said yesterday, what he took a personal interest in. Things that he personally got attached to and had deep feelings about and really, really firm beliefs were the things that he pushed on. SDI was one of those things. The Pentecostals are one of those things. Other, Soviet dissidents. But he tells Schultz in these meetings, push with Dobrynin on the Pentecostals. Let's get these people out of the embassy. And Schultz sees this as kind of a catalyst to move the relationship forward. If the Soviets do this and Reagan doesn't crow publicly about it, it will demonstrate to the Soviets that they can negotiate with Reagan, that he can be reasonable, that they can move this relationship in a new direction. And that is actually what happens. So by July, the Pentecostals get released. Reagan doesn't make a big deal out of it. He does in private. He talks about it in his diaries. It comes out in other documents. But, he doesn't go have a press conference that he pushed the Soviets to release these people. It happens very quietly, and Schultz sees that as a major victory to push this relationship forward. It is very slow progress in 1983. But, you know, things happen, but they happen slowly. So one other aspect of the paper, I don't want to run over time because I know we have a lot to get to, is Schultz's internal difficulties with the National Security Council. He and Reagan had this quiet diplomacy plan. They had talked about it in their meetings, but there were the hardliners at the NSC that Reagan talked about in that diary entry. You know, how does he get those people on board? Bill Clark was in a really interesting position, you know. I wrote in here about a February 4th memo that Clark sent to Reagan. And Schultz seems to think that Clark is one of the hardliners, not on the side of change, wants to thwart all progress with the Soviet Union. But in this February 4th memo, he actually lays out a lot of the same ideas that Schultz had also talked about. Clark wrote to Reagan that one major concern was that there was a deeply felt ideological bias that exists within your administration against arms control. This small group of professionals centered in the Defense Department believes that arms control generically is bad. So Clark understood that there were these massive bureaucratic hurdles in dealing with the DoD, dealing with the State Department, and the Soviet Union. So how you move forward. Clark continued in this memo to Reagan that it would be worthwhile because it would make clear that you are not ideologically against solving problems with the Soviet Union. It would show that you are at least willing to try. So Clark sent this to Reagan. He said at the bottom that he didn't send it to anyone else. So it's unclear who else at the NSC saw this and knew that Clark had these positions. Schultz definitely didn't know, because Schultz and Clark were butting heads about this throughout the entire period until June 15th, when they have a meeting, when these positions that Schultz had been talking with Reagan about opening consulates in Kiev and New York, moving ahead with cultural agreements, restarting these kinds of things that would really be small steps in moving the Soviet and U.S. relationship forward. So my main argument here is that without Schultz, and without Schultz's discussions with Reagan and his understanding that Reagan really did want to open up this relationship, he wanted to have productive negotiations, and he thought that his ability to talk to the Soviets could help improve things. But without Schultz, I'm not sure where we would have ended up. When Jack Matlock comes into the NSC in the fall, Schultz definitely gains an ally in the Soviet Union. I mean, in the NSC, about the Soviet Union, sorry. It's time. So anyway, Schultz was a really big catalyst in all of this, and I will stop there. Sorry I ran over.
No.
I did run over because I didn't give you time to finish.
My fault.
No, thanks very much, Elizabeth and James. Now we'll hear from Matthias.
Sorry, you didn't get to finish. You should have cut me off.
All right, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this historic day. Today I'm going to talk about the impact of Reagan's election on the transatlantic relationship, particularly during the first term, because Reagan's election is, particularly in Europe, still seen to have marked quite a fundamental sea change in a sense, moving the US policy back towards an openly confrontational stance against the Soviet Union, triggering the Second Cold War, and so on. And in West European domestic politics, too, Reagan became the very symbol of a new Cold War stance they rejected, with the growth of peace movements, for whom Reagan acted, of course, as an ideal unifier. So in popular memory, Reagan's election is still seen to have marked quite a sharp break in the transatlantic relationship. But as historians, we, of course, now know that things weren't that simple. And many historians have pointed to much greater continuity with the Carter administration and much more gradual rift starting with the Carter presidency. So in this context, what I want to do is to assess the short-term impact of Reagan's election on the transatlantic relationship from a West European perspective by comparing and contrasting transatlantic relations first under Carter and then during Reagan's first term. And I want to do this particularly through the prism of high-level diplomacy between Reagan and his two most important European counterparts, Helmut Schmidt, the West German Chancellor at the time, and Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. Why? Well, Britain and Germany were, of course, the two most important members, European members of NATO. But second, also, because Britain and Germany are commonly seen to illustrate quite different attitudes towards the transatlantic relationship. On the one hand, we have the so-called special Anglo-American relationship, famously embodied by Thatcher's relationship with Reagan. On the other hand, we have the US-German relationship, where West Germany, of course, also depended on American security, but frequently appeared much more outspokenly critical, particularly in public, about the various American administrations. So at the danger of kind of reading too much into these images, both countries are riding in the kind of NATO Gulf cart, but Thatcher is quite happy to let the American president take the lead, where Schmidt looks much more skeptical and perhaps secretly thinks he would be the better driver. So it is interesting to see how these two kind of countries coped with the Reagan challenge, so to speak, in the early 80s. And finally, why focus on high-level diplomacy? I think because high-level diplomacy has frequently been seen to have been responsible for the deterioration in transatlantic relations, both under Carter and Reagan. Either, Carter's alleged naivety, inexperience in office, the peanut farmer, etc., or Reagan's sort of reckless cowboy policy with little regard for European sensitivities. But what I actually want to suggest is that these high-level dynamics have actually tended to obscure our view of the much deeper structural differences tearing the United States and Western Europe apart from at least the early 70s onwards. I argue that the frequent high-level clashes merely brought to the fore and perhaps accelerated much deeper conflicts and contradictions between superpower and inner European détente that had always been ingrained in the different American and European Cold War strategies since the early 70s. Whereas for the Americans, détente had by and large been a sort of kind of settling of the geostrategic status quo in the early 70s, which was seen to have kind of outlived its usefulness by the late 70s. For the Europeans, détente had always had a more dynamic element, the idea of kind of creating political economic interlinkages, interdependencies that would in the long run create path dependencies, trigger long-term transformations, etc. And I think it is really that ingrained sort of inbuilt tension that triggers the transatlantic clashes both under Carter and then under Reagan. So I'm going to start with Carter first and then go to Reagan. So the transatlantic relationship under Carter was, of course, overshadowed by sort of testy and vile clashes between Carter and Schmidt. Part of it was a sort of personality clash, the cool-headed, pragmatic North German Helmut Schmidt and the more idealistic, somewhat kind of missionary-minded Carter. One only has to look at how they describe each other in their memoirs. Schmidt calls his chapter on Carter idealistic and fickle, and Carter, in the kind of the White House diaries published in 2010, writes that Schmidt was a strong-willed and competent Chancellor of Germany who seemed to believe that he knew more about each of the other G7 nations than did the elected leaders. And you have Schmidt standing at the podium for US president talking down on Carter. But more fundamentally, I think, the Schmidt-Carter rift also reveals these deeper tensions between American and European Cold War strategies. The most obvious issue is, of course, human rights. Carter, on the one hand, sees no problem in openly calling out Soviet human rights abuses. He thinks détente only makes sense if he's able to say this, and still thinks he can pursue arms control simultaneously. Whereas the Germans, on the other hand, feared that Carter's agenda would be perceived by the Soviets as a more general threat to their political legitimacy that was likely to jeopardize inner European détente. So they voiced their discontent very early on. And interestingly, given the kind of different attitudes towards transatlantic relations I alluded to earlier, the British largely shared German concerns. Already under Labour Prime Minister James Callaghan, the British are quite critical of the American stance behind closed doors. But the most striking example of a sort of shared European view on the Cold War that included Britain can be found in the transatlantic response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Britain now, of course, under Margaret Thatcher. And here the American call for strong political economic sanctions put the West Europeans in a dilemma. On the one hand, Soviet aggression illustrated at first hand their own vulnerability, their continuing dependency on the United States. On the other hand, the confrontational course pursued by the Carter administration was seen to jeopardize the achievements of inner European détente further. And even though the public rhetoric of Britain and Germany was very different, with Thatcher being much more forceful than Schmidt, the actual policies were remarkably similar. Britain was a major influence behind the European Community's proposal for neutralization of Afghanistan in February 1980, and continued to strongly resist any economic sanctions that went beyond mere symbolic gestures. The difference, of course, was that the British did that behind closed doors, whereas Schmidt could score quite a few political points by doing so in public. Nonetheless, I do think you have the emergence of an increasingly homogeneous West European position, and that did not escape American attention. As early as March 1980, for example, Carter's National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, complains to Carter in a memo that the West Europeans had, in effect, done nothing in their bilateral relations with the Soviets to show their displeasure and concern over the invasion of Afghanistan, and interestingly, he includes Britain in this criticism. While the UK had taken a strong public lead, it had resisted any of our proposals which would cost money, and recently, for its Afghanistan neutralization proposal, the UK has been distancing itself more from the US, seeking to return to the European Community fold. So the Europeans are increasingly seen to gang up on the Americans in the late Carter years, including Britain, in spite of its kind of different public rhetoric. So on the surface, you have these kind of personality clashes between Carter and Schmidt about adequate transatlantic consultations and so on, but I think these have tended to overshadow the sort of wider strategic tensions behind these debates. And this is what we can see when we look at Reagan's election. So initially, the West European reaction was very positive. After a quick visit to Washington shortly after the election, Schmidt tells Thatcher how the new president had made it very clear that he wanted closer cooperation and consultation, and that the US might finally be back on a steady and calculable course. After a couple of months, Thatcher agrees, thinking that transatlantic relationship will be much better, will be much firmer, and much more widely discussed. And they do make quite a few moves to improve this. They have very early summit meetings as opposed to the Carter years. They appoint Arthur Burns as ambassador to West Germany. He was a close friend of Schmidt since the 50s. But all these kind of improvements in transatlantic communication, I think, are insufficient to overcome the wider strategic gap that had emerged between the US and Western Europe. Most immediate issue is, of course, Reagan's more combative stance against the Soviet Union, which was seen by the Europeans to endanger the main premise of NATO's dual-track decision to rearm and negotiate rearmaments simultaneously and in parallel, the two tracks, where there is, of course, a significant domestic dynamic to this as well, as the peace movements in Germany include quite a few members of Schmidt's own party as well, of the Social Democrats. So Schmidt is in a position where his party demonstrates against his policies as Chancellor. So the West Europeans tried to cooperate quite closely to mediate the American administration's stance. As early as January 1989, Secretary of State Al Haig writes to Reagan how Thatcher had appeared deeply concerned that we take into account the situation in the Federal Republic of Germany. Mrs. Thatcher almost pleaded with me in London that we take care not to isolate Chancellor Schmidt, whom she described as a really good friend of the US. But again, we can see a kind of split of philosophy. So the West Europeans are kind of desperate to hang on to arms control talks, to détente, both for domestic party politics and wider strategic reasons, whereas the Americans seem increasingly convinced that it had outlived its usefulness. And this mirrors kind of the tensions within the administration as well between defense and state. Next to that note by Haig, for example, somebody scribbled in handwriting, I don't know who it was, probably Richard Allen, that who cares? State does, but why? Not our job to keep Schmidt in power or any of the others. State is too concerned in saving European governments, and lets that become overriding concern in US policy. And these dynamics then, of course, intensify again with the Siberian gas pipeline tensions. West Europeans think the pipeline is a kind of welcome opportunity to extend economic interlinkages, to diversify their own energy supplies. The Americans fear the Soviets would be able to blackmail Western Europe. They also fear further influx of hard currency into the Eastern Bloc. So again, we have these kind of different conceptions of détente coming in. National Security Council analysis in October 1981 gets that quite right, saying an important US objective is to cap or reduce the level of Western, or at least West European trade with the Soviets, but a basic West European objective to sustain or increase the level of that trade is directly contradictory. So you kind of have the path dependencies from the early 70s at play here. And it's not surprising that when the Reagan administration tries to use the declaration of martial law in Poland to delay or cancel the pipeline, the Europeans, including Thatcher, are completely united in their resistance. But for the Americans, including for Reagan himself, the question had become one of principle. National Security Council meeting on 24th of May, for example, 1982, Reagan says, "We said there would be more punishments coming, and here, well, Lisa is still in jail and we are talking about relaxing the sanctions. We will lose all credibility. We talk well, but the Europeans will always back off. Soviet Union is economically on the ropes. They're selling rat meat on the market. This is the time to punish them. The Europeans should tell the Russians to ease up in Poland, relax martial law, release Walesa. We're not able to afford politically to relax. The Europeans should have a bit of guts. Why don't we provide the leadership and tell the Europeans who is the enemy? It is not us." So just to conclude very briefly, I think by the end of 1982, the state of transatlantic relations is actually not that much different than it had been towards the end of the Carter presidency, whatever the initial European hopes had been. Again, the Europeans think they have a president who seems unpredictable, who seems kind of single-minded, and who pursues interests that do not take into account European interests. I think this is relatively regardless of the personalities in power, but due primarily to the deeper strategic differences emanating from the different conceptions of superpower versus in a European détente. So what then, if anything, was the Reagan factor or the Reagan revolution for the transatlantic relationship? I think it is the fact that his kind of outspoken nature, his controversial nature, his ability to put complex issues into really simple language kind of puts these issues at the forefront of transatlantic debates. So these different kind of conceptions had always existed since the late 1960s. Schmidt himself says, the TNF problem goes back to the Nixon failure to include it in SALT I. But in the early 70s, these differences had been papered over by the kind of nice, benevolent diplomacy between Nixon, Ford, Kissinger, and the Europeans. And then from the mid-70s onwards, they had been explained by the Europeans quite superficially and simplistically by just reducing it all to kind of Carter's inexperience in office and idealism. It was only the Reagan administration's clear course, as sort of unequivocal language and strategy, that made the West Europeans realize that there were much more fundamental and seemingly irreconcilable differences between American and European Cold War strategies, and they took their conclusions from it as the 80s went on, as did the Americans. And I think George Schultz is also very important in terms of the transatlantic relationship then from 82 onwards. So at the end of the first term, I think the Reagan factor was that Reagan managed to bring these deeper issues to the fore, that he made them visible both to European decision makers and indeed to the wider publics as well, which is why he proved such a controversial figure in early 1980s Europe. And I'm going to shut up now. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Matthias. Susan.
All right, Matthias is going to pull something up for me. Okay, thank you. And thank you. Is it?
Where's it going? There's.
There. Are we good? Thanks, Matthias. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I know it is a day where you could be watching many other things, and so I'm very happy that you've joined us. I'm going to try to pick up some threads from all of the other papers and say a few more things about transatlantic relations, mostly focusing on Reagan's first term in office. And I wanted to start with this image. It's from Christmas 1980. It was done for a British newspaper called The Socialist Worker. So it's right before Reagan comes into office. Maggie Thatcher is already in office. This is, of course, Reagan and Thatcher. It's modeled off of the poster for Gone with the Wind. And it, I think, encapsulates a few things about public assumptions about Reagan and Thatcher quite well. So the tagline is, "She promised to follow him to the end of the earth. He promised to organize it." And there are some subtle hints here that maybe are too small for you to read, but it really ties together Thatcher and Reagan as a new era in many senses. So not just in a defense buildup and the looming threat of nuclear war, but also in terms of their economic policies. So in one place here it says, Milton Friedman in association with Pentagon Pictures, right? So linking that conservative economic ideology with the defense buildup. And this really plays into something Elizabeth and Matthias both talked about about Reagan's reputation as a saber rattler, a button pusher, an anti-Soviet crusader. And I want to talk today a little bit about how those kinds of perceptions impacted transatlantic relations. And certainly these predated Reagan's time in office. In 1976, when he runs against Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination, he famously derides détente, saying that it has given the United States nothing more than the right to sell Pepsi Cola in Siberia. Then, once he becomes president, in his first press conference, right, he comments about how the Soviet Union will do anything. They reserve the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to ensure the spread of communism. And that phrasing becomes a shorthand for the administration's hardline approach at the time, but also in common memory. I mean, it's come up already a handful of times, and we're only on the second panel of papers. He even used détente to explain his administration's policies in the war on drugs. He said that there would be no détente with the mob. And he linked détente to a broader sense of malaise, of Western weakness, and of a decline of the United States. So things like the Iran hostage crisis as a sort of visceral sign of American decline. It was there in his 1976 bid against Ford, and it certainly loomed large when he runs against Carter in 1980. So we often talk of détente dying in the 1970s, be it in Angola, in the Horn of Africa, or certainly with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on Christmas Day 1979. In this narrative, then, the 1980s see a return to the Cold War, a new Cold War, a second Cold War, and what did remain of détente was European in nature. So this narrative goes, Reagan only returns to détente and diplomacy in the second term in his storied cooperation with Mikhail Gorbachev. This is maybe part of the reversal school that's been mentioned, but fits in a number of other interpretations as well. But one of the big conundrums I'm trying to deal with in my work is that throughout both of Reagan's terms in office, NATO itself as an institution continues to espouse détente as official policy. It is there in the 1967 Harmel Report, and it remains reaffirmed time and time again, including in 1984. So why? I mean, if the Reagan administration is accused of jettisoning détente, of abandoning it, particularly in the first term, I want to talk about what this paradox between the administration and NATO means, and to suggest a few possible explanations and conclusions we can draw. So the Reagan administration did try to move away from the two-pronged approach of deterrence and détente that had been outlined in the 1967 Harmel Report. But their attempts to do so caused public transatlantic rifts and helped spur on widespread criticism, yet again, about whether the alliance could survive. This interestingly intersected with generational concerns that young people, particularly the young people taking to the streets in Western Europe, in Canada, and the United States against nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war, did not appreciate the reasons that NATO had been made in the first place. They simply couldn't remember the Second World War anymore. But often, as was the case, I believe, in 1982 over the Siberian pipeline issue, the administration's efforts to move away from the Harmel Report, in fact, undermined other aspects of the administration's goals in transatlantic relations, such as on INF. The administration itself was divided over how to handle East-West relations. In one telling moment, when Haig outlines a U.S. foreign policy plan for 1982, Richard Pipes, in one of his many myriad long memos, writes back that this is a strategy that the United States has already tried. It failed. It was known as détente. But the power within the administration shifts, particularly with the Haig-Schultz transition, and Schultz champions an approach that I think resembles in many ways the two tracks. You also have a fundamental shift in a perception of U.S. power and U.S. confidence. In short, the administration regains its confidence around 1983 and feel now that they can comfortably negotiate. So you have early opposition to Reagan. His defense buildup is seen as a sign of a war-fighting strategy. People wonder whether Reagan will even sit down with the Soviets. When Schmidt comes to Washington in May 1981, he emphasizes that this is the most important question he is going to get at home. And this mattered in large part because of the structure of the dual-track decision. Matthias alluded to it, but by pairing the deployment of new U.S. missiles with U.S. negotiations with the Soviet Union, it created a vicious cycle. The Carter administration had summarized it as a clear long-term problem. In order to keep consensus for the deployment of the missiles, particularly in West European basing countries, on board until the deployments were scheduled in 1983, the United States needed progress on arms control. But they feared and assumed that they would get no progress on arms control until the missiles were deployed. So how then do you paper over this years-long problem? The Reagan administration stays the course with the dual-track decision, although there are suggestions that they should leave it. In November 1981, Reagan unveils a negotiating position, the zero option, which offers to stop U.S. deployments if the Soviets scrap their existing Euro missiles. The speech itself, where he unveils it, is designed to cultivate a statesman-like image. This is something the New York Times comments on at length. And it responded directly to mounting fears about nuclear war, like the large-scale anti-nuclear demonstrations which had taken place in October of 1981. But many didn't believe it. The next month, Time magazine conducted a poll where 50% of respondents said that Reagan had simply made these remarks for political and propaganda reasons. Then, on the 29th of December 1981, Reagan announces new restrictions on the export of oil and gas technologies to the Soviet Union as part of a sanctions package on Poland and the Soviet Union after the implementation of martial law. Washington's allies within NATO saw them as lopsided, unfair, out of sync, and rife with double standards. It seemed to go against all of the earlier contingency planning that NATO had done, because all of NATO's contingency planning had been based on the premise of what they would do if the Soviets invaded. The Europeans and the Canadians responded by saying clearly the Soviets had not invaded. Many in the Reagan administration derided that reaction as naive and irresponsible. Washington doesn't introduce a grain embargo. Reagan has just repealed Carter's grain embargo from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and this is seen as yet further evidence that the Americans are interested more in punishing their allies than in punishing the Soviets. Mostly, it boils down to the fact that many of the Europeans and the Canadians don't understand what Reagan is doing. At the American Enterprise Institute, the Minister of Commerce, Michel Joubert, famously remarks, "You are asking us to go with you on a journey, but you are not telling us where you are heading and where we will end up." Nicholas Henderson, the British ambassador in Washington, concluded that this was symptomatic of a bigger problem. U.S. foreign policy under Reagan was a muddle. The pipeline brought up a much larger debate. It was really, at its core, a debate about NATO's approach to East-West relations, one that became embodied by a competition between Bonn and Washington. Genscher, the German foreign minister, accused the Reagan administration of abandoning the Harmel Report, and Schmidt and Genscher worked tirelessly in the spring of 1982 to reject and push back on U.S. calls to overhaul the strategy. They pointed to the need for consensus in order to keep the next year's deployments of INF on track, arguing that any divisions, such as a reanalyzation of strategy, would only present Moscow with more opportunities to divide the alliance. But the senior interagency group pressed on. They looked for ways to reformulate without directly challenging Harmel. And they offered, for instance, in the Eureka College speech in May, a 5-point approach to East-West relations. But paradoxically, they also looked to use Eureka and then the later trip to Europe that June as a public relations move to offset images of Reagan as bombastic as a nuclear cowboy. Instead, they looked to cultivate an image of Reagan as a man of peace. They even propose placing photo ops with Mother Teresa to help cultivate this image. And they talk about the Eureka College speech as one that should remind audiences of JFK's address at American University in 1963. And they looked to blunt the power of anti-nuclear protests both at home and abroad. The British shared this hope. In one such cable, they insist that it would be much better if he appeared more like a friendly uncle than a nuclear cowboy. But it failed in large part. The address that Reagan gave, for instance, at British Parliament, so famous for him commenting about leaving communism on the ash heap of history, was actually a fairly confused speech, or at least so the British cabled back. But the confusing nature of the speech was long forgotten, and it was remembered for the remarks about the ash heap of history. Problems then only get worse in 1982. After the Bonn and Versailles summits, the Reagan administration introduces another set of sanctions over huge opposition within the administration. They're met with a furious response by many of the allies. One British official remarks, "What is the good of discussing things and reaching agreed assessments if, ignoring solidarity, the United States goes ahead on its own regardless. The Canadian ambassador in Washington, Alan Gottlieb, remarked in his diary that the Americans must rule the world. European firms ended up simply ignoring the rules, and the British and Canadians hoped to resolve the problems trying to bridge the Atlantic. Ultimately, they did come to a solution, in large part due to George Schultz's role. Schultz has succeeded Haig at this point. But the fundamental questions about East-West relations remain open. In an article in Foreign Affairs in the autumn of 1982, Hans-Dietrich Genscher offers a clear vision of what he thinks relations should be like, which is fundamentally the Harmel vision. Reagan, Genscher writes, had spoken of Allied unity as a precursor to relations with the East, but Genscher insisted it was the inverse formulation that needed to happen. If the West had no strategy for East-West relations, how could they be united or cohesive? Problems only seemed to get worse. US-Soviet relations seemed to deteriorate, and there was a widespread sentiment that there was no dialogue between the superpowers. Reagan gives the Evil Empire speech in March 1983 and then unveils SDI. Peace protesters continue to march. The United States tried throughout 1983 to improve its image. Bush made trips to Western Europe and to Canada to assuage public concerns and address protesters' concerns. The United States introduces 2 interim proposals at the INF negotiations in Geneva in the hopes, in part, of combating these public relations problems. They even stayed at the INF talks after the September shootdown of the Korean airliner. But these US negotiations were often dismissed as a public relations move, even within the alliance. When Pierre Trudeau, for instance, launched his peace mission, he points to the need to jumpstart dialogue between Washington and Moscow. To be sure, INF was a public relations issue, and it had been since the Carter administration. But was that all it was? I argue that the answer is no. It also gave the administration a means of testing its relationship with Moscow while looking to reconcile competing impulses within the administration. Reagan's own advisors disagreed about the importance of negotiations, especially before US strength had improved. And Reagan had cultivated a domestic reputation as an opponent of détente, one that still mattered for his political position. But at the same time, he was faced with the need to be seen as a responsible custodian of immense US power, including the nuclear arsenal, to keep INF on track. I want to conclude briefly by linking this back to a discussion we had yesterday about structure versus agents. And I want to suggest that maybe it can be a little bit of both, and to talk about where that fits in my paper. So the problems that Reagan faced were, I think, and I think Matthias laid this out as well, in many respects, continuations of Carter-era disagreements. Many of the conversations, for instance, that happened over the Polish sanctions are similar to the conversations that happened over Afghanistan in 1980. And Reagan stayed the course with many of the existing policies that committed Reagan to dialogue with the Soviet Union, many of which were relics of the Carter years. But Reagan, the individual, his leadership style, and his public reputation all exacerbated the situation. He became an embodiment for many people of what was wrong or flawed with US foreign policy, and you can see this in certainly the kind of anti-nuclear and peace protesting material that was produced in this era. He also played into stereotypes about the United States. There's a prominence of this cowboy rhetoric, and certainly within the transatlantic community, this cowboy rhetoric intersects with a broader assumption that because Reagan is from California, he simply can't appreciate the value of the transatlantic partnership because he is too far removed from the Atlantic to really get it. And this is amplified by the fact that the California team is how his administration is so often described. I also can't help but think about some parallels with other cowboy presidents of US history, someone like Lyndon Baines Johnson or George W. Bush. Often this language of cowboy is used as a very pejorative stereotype about America. But it also meant this image of Reagan and of Reagan as the hardliner meant that the ways that he did remain committed to dialogue with the Soviet Union were often ignored. So talks like the INF talks or the Mutual and Balanced Force Reduction talks, which had been taking place since the 70s, were not seen as meaningful dialogue, but instead as a formulaic exercise to manage West-West relations instead of East-West relations. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much to all of you, our panelists for excellent presentations and for keeping us on time so that we have a good chunk of time for questions from the audience. Let me just make a couple of observations. First, I think these presentations underscore the value of this conference. It really is a perfect time to be taking a hard, serious academic look at the Reagan administration, which had been sort of dominated by competing narratives of Reagan as an innocent, naive, but also reckless, or Reagan, the Reagan hagiography of Reagan who did it all. I think all these papers show a sort of a different and more nuanced and sort of more balanced way of understanding the Reagan years. The second observation is this is implicit in several of the papers, but I just make it explicit, and that is to try to explain the difference between Reagan's words and some of his deeds. And I think to say that they were duplicitous is not really to capture the point. It's that the words themselves had independent meaning for Reagan to a greater degree than any other recent president, certainly more than for his successor, George H.W. Bush, and certainly more than for his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. For Reagan, the words had force, and they could stand alone as an element of American foreign policy, and then the other elements of American power and influence he treated in more or less somewhat more traditional fashion. So I think that's the way I tend to understand Reagan's use of sometimes scary rhetoric. So with that, let me open it to the audience. If you could please identify yourself. We have a microphone coming around. If you could identify yourself briefly and then state a question. You can either throw it to the audience, to the panel as a whole, or to individual speakers. Yes, please.
Hi, I have a question for Susan, and I was really struck.
Sarah, please identify yourself.
Oh, sorry, Sarah Snyder from American University. I was struck by your suggestion that the transition from Haig to Schultz we might see as a return to this sort of dual track approach of détente and deterrence. And I was hoping, particularly given that it's the title of your dissertation, that you could therefore explain more what you mean by détente, and particularly how much you see it as a strategy to manage Cold War competition versus to end the Cold War. So, thanks.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is a question I grapple with often, and part of what I'm dealing with in my dissertation is about how détente can mean many things to many people at the same time, and the language itself tends to obscure and paper over some of the deeper conflicts. But it strikes me that what you see, and I don't know if it's necessarily that Schultz and Haig feel very differently about how they are going to approach U.S.-Soviet relations, which is something Elizabeth and James might comment on more than me, but the fact that Schultz, to me, has he manages to command more weight within the administration. He's not plagued by the personality problems that Haig is plagued by. Certainly that's one of the factors, to put it mildly. But Schultz also manages to converse with Reagan on these topics in a way that that he gets the president on side in a much more obvious and clear way. In terms of what I think is there on détente in Schultz is, I think it is these 4 points that Elizabeth is talking about. To me, that 4-point strategy is very in line with the major issues that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Canadians debate as a détente strategy in the late 60s, throughout the 70s, and into the 80s. So I guess that to me is the neatest encapsulation of why I see it in that two-pronged light.
I can just jump in very quickly. Schultz is also important because he's has very good relations with both Thatcher and Schmidt, and they're very disappointed in 81 when Schultz doesn't get nominated. And Haig is a kind of buddy Old Boys Network guy as well, but he's very ineffective, and actually trying to get him in, and they're very relieved when he actually does come in because he seems to have some influence at both sides, personal relations.
Professor Nell?
Excellent papers, all. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you maybe I'm sorry, Henry Now, George Washington University. Just a specific question maybe to each, because in so many cases, it's so important to keep the larger context in mind when you're examining more specific aspects of policy in this period or policy in any period. Tomasz, I wondered, you said nothing about the Soviet military buildup on the borders of Poland in 1981, some 25 divisions or so that were eventually moved into a position to invade Poland. Did the Reagan defense buildup, did the fact that Reagan had spent that first year successfully getting his economic and defense programs, or in large measure, some measure at least, through Congress, did that have anything to do with the possibility that it made the Soviet Union think twice about a 1956 style or 68 style intervention in Poland? Elizabeth and James, I wonder, Elizabeth, if you took the April comment in his diary, Reagan's comment in his diary, and put it together with the two quotes that I presented yesterday, the 63 and the 81, well, it's not very shocking. And it suggests that maybe Reagan was really using Schultz rather than Schultz somehow or other persuading Reagan. And finally, in the case of Matthias and Susan, I think the only thing that Reagan really cared about in terms of the alliance in the early years, 81 to 83, was the deployment of the INF. That was the essential purpose. He had to revive a sense in the Soviet mind that NATO was alive and well after their invasion of Afghanistan, after their threatening posture towards Poland, etc. And if you think, I mean, if that is his main purpose, then a lot of other things seems to be fall into place. I mean, the pipeline sanctions was designed really to let the Europeans know, look, we've got a serious issue here, and we can't, on the one hand, be buying gas from the Soviet Union and somehow or other convince our publics to deploy the INF weapons. Schultz later said that the INF deployment was the key turning point of the war, because in his conversations with the Soviet officials, it made the biggest impression upon them. They knew now who they were dealing with in terms of the Reagan administration.
I will begin by saying that in December 1980, certainly when the prospect of a Soviet intervention seems most realistic, Reagan is not even there yet. So I guess when we are talking about the later buildup and the Soviet response to it, this only comes into play in the second term, and of course has enormous consequences. But about this particular situation in December 1980, I don't think the Soviets were afraid of a U.S. military reaction. I think they were more concerned with what's going to happen in Poland. I think they had some doubts about the reliability of the Polish army, and they thought that it's not going to look like in Czechoslovakia. It will be more like Hungary in '56, but on a scale much grander. And they were more concerned with economic sanctions. So there are various moments in the 80s when the threat of intervention comes into play. But what I would emphasize is the fact that as the Soviets spend more and more in the second half of the 80s on their own response to the SDI and so on and so forth, they become increasingly aware of the burdens of their empire in Eastern Europe, and it actually becomes clear for both the leadership and then eventually for the public that they are in fact subsidizing Eastern Europe in many ways. So they come to a kind of a conclusion that it's not worth to intervene because they are actually the ones who are helping to maintain that, to prop up that region economically.
Thank you for that question, Henry, because that is, I did not mean to insinuate that Schultz was pushing Reagan's policy. It was definitely Reagan's policy and Reagan's ideas, and Schultz was the way that Reagan could execute this. Schultz said in his memoir, either a document that I have, that he felt very much that Reagan was almost being held hostage by his NSC staff in some ways on these policies. So I think Schultz was, like you said, the way that Reagan could kind of execute this was through Schultz. And I think one interesting example of that too is the Matlock January '84 speech, the Ivan and Anya speech. So Matlock wrote several drafts of that, and Reagan read it, and he was like, "What? Why is this so new and revolutionary? This is what I've been trying to do all along." So for Reagan, he had these very set ideas that this was how he wanted to approach the Soviets. These were the things he was trying to do, but he didn't realize that his public rhetoric and his stance, made it hard for other people and the Soviets and the Europeans and everyone else to see that was his vision. So I think that's another good example of that.
If I could just, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let me just add one word about your question about the impact of INF deployment. I think you're exactly right. I mean, the Soviet peace offensive, which they believed was working, was designed to divide the Western alliance. And I was in Germany at the time, and the mantra in the streets was, the shorter the mission, the missiles, the deader the Germans. And Schmidt deserves great credit for standing up to that domestic pressure, but Reagan too, for seeing the importance of getting a NATO consensus. Tough though it was and contentious though it was, NATO came together. And the final point is, the great irony is that this Soviet campaign then blew back on Eastern Europe, because as détente went into a deep freeze, US-Soviet détente went into deep freeze, the East Europeans had now become exposed, and it sort of added to the ferment there. Sir.
Yeah, I'll stand up from the back. Steve Hayward from UC Berkeley. I've got a question for Susan, though I think I'd love to hear Elizabeth Charles and James Wilson comment on it, because I may have a perspective on it too. Well, the first is an FYI. Reagan put that poster up in the workshop of his barn at his Santa Barbara ranch, because he liked it and thought it was fun. Well, you can still see it today, by the way. My question is, Susan, I'm not quite sure I heard you right, and so if I got this wrong or badly wrong, sort me out, but I thought I heard you say that you thought Reagan's Westminster speech of 1982 was confused. I thought that was the adjective you used. And I wonder if I have that roughly right. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why you think it is confused.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually, that's a direct quotation from a British official who observed the speech and then wrote a summary for the Afl-Cio. So he said that it was a rather confused, if not confusing, speech, right? That's how he characterizes it. And he talks about there being two different impulses in the speech. So one is this hardline, bombastic, right, communism on the ash heap of history, what the speech is famous for, and the other is a much more conciliatory tone about just wanting a sign from the Soviet Union that they will match their deeds to their words. And so, and what I find so, I talk about it in the paper, I unfortunately cut it for my remarks, but what I find so fascinating about that assessment is that the assumption that this British official makes is that the hardline stuff is the real Reagan, and that the conciliatory, all we need is a sign kind of rhetoric is actually the speechwriters trying to moderate Reagan's tone to make the Europeans happy. And to me, I mean, that strikes me as exactly the opposite of true, but the fact that that is even what the internal Afl-Cio assessment of the speech is telling about how much Reagan's rhetoric takes over from Reagan's policies and how they can be at odds with one another in reality, but for even Thatcher's Britain, considered to be the closest of the Allies, even internally, they think that the hardline Reagan is the real Reagan.
I think you know the kind of, I think we share that this is a pivotal speech in the Reagan administration. I mean, I kind of view it, and this is Reagan launching a crusade for freedom, launches the National Endowment for Democracy. I wrestle with this speech a lot, and I kind of wonder who is the audience, and in my sense is that this is very much, the audience is kind of shoring up the Western alliance on the eve of the beginning of the START negotiations, and in this broader period of the INF deployment. It is probably Reagan's best speech, and you know, a number of, it's definitely worth digging into it, particularly the way it was put together with Mark Palmer and sent out to George Will to look over, and really, really very important moment.
Josh Schifrinson?
Yeah, Josh Schifrinson, Bush School of Government, Texas A&M University. James, Elizabeth, I guess I'll pose a question to the two of you, but it may go to a broader theme for this panel. The notion of a Reagan reversal has been bandied about over and over in this conference thus far, in this panel thus far. But in reading over, James, the most recent Fruce volume that you assembled, I'm struck by all the elements that actually don't seem reversally. I'm going to use that as a term now. This is from Schultz's own non-paper to Reagan, November of '87. Our interest is to keep the Russians well behind us. Number one, going on to describe using SDI and INF negotiations as a tool to get the Soviets to negotiate on American terms, and then concluding with a discussion describing how any deals have to lock the Soviets into our positions and reify our advantages. So if that's the case, maybe the notion of a Reagan reversal and the advent of Schultz and Matlock as a zeitgeist change of the Reagan administration is overdone. And what's going on here is really a shift from the desire on Reagan's part to maximize American advantages is constant, but what changes are the tools used to get there. I'm just wondering how how you would respond to that interpretation, because it seems that there is some discordant evidence even with this Reagan reversal narrative.
I don't think there was a reversal. I agree with everything you just said. I think, yeah. You're always right, Josh.
Let's not go that
But
far.
no, we're not going to go that far. But I think in Mel Leffler's, chapter on this, and for the soul of, you deal with all of this. And I think Beth Fisher's Reagan reversal paper and assessment was a very long time ago. It was before we had a lot of this documentation. It was before we were able to see a lot of these things. But I think there is a consistent Reagan. The way he thinks about the Soviets, the way he thinks about these negotiations, to me, seems to be very consistent from the beginning to the end. He is optimistic about his ability to deal with it. He does want to build up first. So, we have this peace through strength. We have to be strong in order to get to the negotiating table. So I don't really see it as a reversal. And like I just said about the Matlock 84 speech, he's like, this is what I've been saying. Why is this new? This is, where mentally he had been, but publicly it was coming off totally differently. So yeah, I really agree with that. I don't think there was a massive reversal in policy. I think it was fairly consistent. If you kind of read all these documents and draw it together, it seems fairly consistent. I don't know if you have.
Can I say a word or two about that particular document you cite, which I think is George Schultz's a memo he wrote on November 18th, 1987. And the first part of that, Schultz writes, because of strength and philosophy, the U.S. relationship will always be unique and always difficult to manage, but it is increasingly clear that the Soviet Union is going to be seen by history as Ronald Reagan's China. The Soviet Union is now changing because of fear of China's reforms, fear of Eastern European restlessness, but most of all, because of fear of falling permanently behind the U.S. And I read that the significance is that by the end of the Reagan administration, that it was still the view of the Soviet Union is Reagan's China, and that's, I think, very important in terms of thinking about Reagan and Europe and the end of the Cold War, because there was tremendous improvement after 8 years, but the Cold War, the fundamental components of it, were still in place when Reagan left office in January of 1989.
Other comments or questions? Yes, please. I'm sorry.
David.
We'll get you next.
David Painter in Georgetown. This is more a comment. I always got the impression, reading the documents and things, that most American policymakers don't consider the British Europeans. And, and when they talk about the Europeans, they don't mean the British. The British are different, the special relationship and all of that. And it's interesting, that they seem to come and go as Europeans in the documents. And that's more of a comment because it always sort of jumps out at you that they get an exemption or they're set off from the Europeans. But that's more of a comment.
Well, I mean, they like that. They don't want to be seen as Europeans. The problem is, and I can say this because I'm German, they are. So if you think about it, for example, on a dual track decision, they are geographically within the range of sub-strategic weapons. Bomber. The reason they invent NATO, in a sense, or kind of are very proactive in NATO's creation, is that they want to, famously keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. This is a very European objective, in a sense. And in the late 70s, both the Callahan government and the Thatcher government is desperate to preserve kind of NATO's cohesion, which means kind of taking care of both American interests and kind of Schmidt's sensibilities about, SS-20s and so on. So they're trying to be the kind of transatlantic mediator for very European objectives, even though they would never say that they're European objectives, but they would say that it's kind of unique role with, churches, three concentric circles or whatever. And just to your point about Schmidt and the SS-20s, and Schmidt would agree with Reagan's assessment that NATO needs to deploy because he thinks he is a big believer in Hamel. He's a big believer on balance of deterrence on all levels, and he thinks they're behind on sub-strategic weapons. So that's why he comes up with the whole speech in the first place with the IISS speech and so on. So he's exactly on Reagan's side, but he can't say this domestically because he has 300,000 people demonstrating against him. He's seen, ironically, domestically, he's seen as a kind of an American satellite, whereas in the States he's seen as this kind of very annoying anti-American kind of voice. So he's kind of falling between stools, in a sense, in his final terms. The pipeline thing, I mean, when martial law gets announced, he's on a state visit in the GDR. Very unfortunate, and he just thinks, thank God it wasn't an invasion. Martial law is fine. Just imagine having Warsaw Pact troops, maybe NATO troops in there, and having kind of GDR and FRG soldiers on Polish soil. That was his biggest nightmare. So he's in a very, very difficult position to kind of play it domestically and play it internationally, and he's increasingly trying to kind of reconcile the irreconcilable in his kind of final few years. So.
If I can just add something on the British unique role, I mentioned for 1 second that the British and the Canadians are the two who really try to bridge the Atlantic, so to speak. And I think it is in part a function of geography and an existential crisis about where you fit in an alliance that is described as the United States and Western Europe when you're not sure if you're either. And the Canadians are certainly sure they're not either, so just forgotten entirely. And the similarities in their approach are stunning, but the differences are also very telling. The British have this sense that they can be a go-between and that they can translate Europe to America and translate America to Europe, and that they can be European when they want and pull out that special relationship card to offset it all. Whereas the Canadians, they take a much more cautious approach, and so they offer to Schultz that they will host a meeting only if Schultz wants, and they'll offer Canadian territory, so they meet in La Sapinière in Quebec, but they're like, you can say it was your idea and it's fine, and we're just worried that, so the Canadian internal assessments are that if the alliance splits, which they genuinely fear is going to happen, it's going to leave the Canadians completely screwed, basically. So their assessments are that in political terms about East-West relations, but on a whole host of other issues, so the law of the sea is a big deal for the Canadians in this period. They disagree with the Reagan administration entirely, but they can't escape geography. And so what happens if their political relations, they want to be closer to Europe, but their economic relations push them in the other direction? Like, they're basically worried that the entire fabric of Canadian foreign relations are going to unravel. And so they handle it, they have the same concerns as the British in one sense, and yet their image of where they fit in this bridging the Atlantic is a very interesting commentary on both of them and how they view the Reagan administration.
The problem is, of course, also that it makes the British much less credible amongst the other West Europeans. I mean, Schmidt famously said the special relationship is so special that only one side knows it exists.
If I could also contribute with a few words, I sometimes substituted Eastern Europe and Poland in my presentation for the sake of brevity, but in the same way as Moscow tried to drive a wedge between America and Europe, so did Americans and Western Europeans did see that Eastern Europe was not really a monolith. There was a lot of differentiation, and Zbigniew Brzezinski already in the 60s, he wrote a book on unity and conflict within the bloc, and there was a conscious policy designed to reward, especially in the 70s, reward some of the good behaving regimes such as Poland, to some extent Hungary, and punish the bad, East Germany, Romania. So in the same way, calling East Germans Eastern Europeans is not exactly accurate, and 99% of Poles consider themselves Central Europeans, and if someone calls them Eastern Europeans, they get offended and point somewhere east of Kiev. So yes, well, you have to look separately at each regime and each single country, and now as Eastern Europe is former Soviet satellites are independent, we actually see how much differentiation there is, even if you look at attitude towards Russia and Putin. I mean, if you look at Poland and Hungary, you could hardly think of different attitudes. So the U.S. was aware of that and tried to play this card as well.
There's a question in the front row.
Giordana Pulcini from the University of Roma Tre. So I wanted to go back to what you were discussing before about continuity, reversal, and even, I mean, the evolution of the idea of detente. And my impression is that this evolution had started before Reagan, and there was a great continuity, not only with Carter, but what was happening in the United States at the end of the 70s. The fact that detente had been designed in the early 70s was not working anymore, and it was not that such a good idea. The build-up started with Carter, the MX missiles, the Trident. The dual-track decision was taken in December 1979. And even the idea of reductions, the fact that the SALT 1 and SALT 2 were not enough, these ideas started to be discussed in the early Carter administration, in March 1977, when they proposed the deep cuts proposal. So maybe it's necessary to, in a way, review all the narrative about Reagan and this idea of evolution, of this idea of change, and see what was happening also before in the 70s and how all these things were evolving. Thank you. It's for everybody who wants to reply.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if we can keep on track. If not, please join me in welcoming the panel. This is a wonderful panel and a wonderful discussion.
We'll answer you.
We'll answer you after.
Wait, there is a question. Go ahead. Okay.
It's a very important question, the continuity of the military buildup, the MX, all of these things. The first thing that pops to my mind is that, I mean, I do think that the Reagan administration, in shifting the terms from SALT to START, that they do deserve tremendous credit. It is different than the kind of SALT framework, and as Admiral Inman said yesterday, I mean, we overlook sometimes the role of verification, but that's extremely important, getting on-site verification. I just want to say very clearly, the deep cuts proposal that the Carter administration tried was a debacle, and that something it's very important for anyone in the first year of administration to be very wary of immediate. And part of the reason that there was such a problem is they came in and they wanted to say, well, we're not going to do what Ford did. We're going to throw out Vladivostok, do our own thing. And there are elements, I think, with MX missile where the Reagan administration, in their effort to be not like Carter, actually wasted some time for a few months by recycling the same conversations that the Carter administration had had about MX basing. But we can talk more about this tomorrow in the panel on nuclear weapons.
And I apologize for cutting off the answer. I didn't mean to do that. Let Let me turn it over to Professor Inboden.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much. So we're going to take a brief coffee break now. Coffee and other refreshments are available outside. I know that our heads are very much in the 1980s right now, but I'm told that there's some sort of event happening in Washington, D.C. today as well. So we will be starting at 11 promptly, showing the presidential inauguration and swearing in an inaugural address. You can consider that an optional part of the program. I imagine there's a range of opinions in the room. Once again, I'll just leave it at that. But it is obviously a very historic moment for the institution of the presidency for the United States, and it certainly would not have felt right to just continue the conference right on through that. And then at noon, we will all move upstairs to salons B and C, where we'll be serving a delicious lunch and hearing a delicious intellectual feast from our lunchtime speaker, Dr. Steve Hayward. So with that, let's go ahead and enjoy some coffee.